All right, so welcome back. Our series continues. Trump is still in the world and we're still here. We are continuing, we're just about halfway through now. Once again, if you are registered, you are supposed to attend the lectures, and if you miss a lecture, we expect you to write a reflection paper. And the way to turn in those papers is by sending them to me as email attachment. So I am in next week, next Tuesday, we will hear Professor Joel Migdal, who will speak about the Middle East cauldron. Then we will move back and look at our own state and look at the some of the activities of Immigration and Customs Enforcement Agency in the state of Washington. And Professor Angelina Godoy will lead us through that discussion. Then the two lectures are on China, Professor David Bachman, on Germany and Europe, Professor Nico Switek, and then we will end with a roundtable discussion on June 4th. Today, I'm very pleased to have Professor Scott Radnitz. Professor Radnitz is the director of Ellison Center for Russian, Eastern European, and Central Asian Studies. He's an expert on post-Soviet politics. He has written articles and books focusing on Central Asia, the Caucasus, and the Russian Federation. I am very pleased that he is going to lead this discussion this afternoon. And the focus, of course, is Russia and Putin. It is the title of the presentation is Trump and Russia in Year 3, Pandering while Punishing. Scott.
I'm going to start with a tweet. You can guess who wrote it. It says, I have been far tougher on Russia than Obama, Bush, or Clinton, maybe tougher than any other president. At the same time, and as often said, getting along with Russia is a good thing, not a bad thing. I fully expect that someday we will have good relations with Russia again. There are two things I want to say about this. First, to quote F. Scott Fitzgerald, the test of a first-rate intelligence is the ability to hold two opposed ideas in mind at the same time and still retain the ability to function. Second, this tweet captures the contradiction, but also the essence of the Trump administration's Russia policy. Trump has one policy, the administration has another. The Mueller report confirmed Trump's interest in Russia and Russia's interest in Trump, which started before the election. To quote from it, although the investigation established that the Russian government perceived it would benefit from a Trump presidency and worked to secure that outcome, and that the campaign expected it would benefit electorally from information stolen and released through Russian efforts, the investigation did not establish that members of the Trump campaign conspired or coordinated. Okay, but this also begs the question of why Russia wanted Trump to win. History isn't usually about just one thing, and in this case, it wasn't all about Trump. So to explain U.S.-Russia relations today, we need to look at three parallel stories. Russia's growing resentment against the U.S. and the West, Putin's personal distaste for Hillary Clinton, and the possibility that Trump might reverse long-standing Russia policy. And now we are more than 2 years into an actual Trump presidency. If Russia thought Trump would be good for business, was it right? My answer is no, but with caveats. Despite Trump's tweets, interviews, and press conferences that can safely be described as ingratiating or pandering, if you were to ask Putin whether he's gotten most of what he wanted from Trump, he would probably be very disappointed. But in 2016, it was clear Russia wanted to see a major shift in US policy and employed hackers and trolls to achieve it. To understand why the Russian government did this, we need to go back a bit to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So in 1991, both the Soviet Union's leaders and citizens were caught by surprise and were pretty unprepared for what came next. In the 90s, Russia suffered from severe economic depression. Its GDP contracted 40% between 1991 and 1998. There was hyperinflation due to shortages of goods. People had their life savings wiped out. The government engaged in privatization reforms, which allowed insiders to buy assets cheaply. The government couldn't enforce the law, or in some cases it was unable to do so, and as a result, organized crime filled the void, and there was street violence. On a personal level, Russians experienced the 90s as a trauma, as a loss of certainty. But these reforms were sold to the public as necessary steps in the transition to democracy and capitalism. So this general sense of turmoil and disorder helped lead to the rise of Putin. Boris Yeltsin appointed Putin his chief of security and then quickly appointed him to prime minister and then abruptly resigned on New Year's Eve, 1999. Putin embodied everything that Yeltsin was not. He was tough, decisive, sober. Putin launched a war against Chechnya, which also helped boost his popularity and helped him win the presidency in a free and fair election in 2000. Putin promised Russians that he would put Russia back on its feet. He would help restore the Russian state and economy and bring back a sense of self-respect. In short, he wanted to make Russia great again. It's a catchy phrase, I didn't coin it. But Putin was intolerant of criticism. He restored state control over the media, marginalized the opposition, reduced the Duma, the Russian legislature, to a rubber stamp, ended elections for governors, and he made clear that the super wealthy, sometimes called the oligarchs, would have to support the state if they wanted to retain their fortunes. On the bright side, the Russian economy bounced back. It led to the rise of a new middle class, new infrastructure was built, there was a booming consumer economy, people now had disposable income, they were able to travel abroad, there was a general mood of optimism. Putin received and took the credit for this success. The narrative was that Putin rebuilt the state through force of will. In actual fact, it helped that the price of oil was also rising during this time, and the Russian economy benefited from reforms that the Yeltsin administration had carried out. But Russians associated democracy with chaos. Under Putin, people were willing to trade personal freedom for stability and a better life. Parallel to this economic story is a geopolitical one. Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, lost its place as the center of an empire. It suffered a shock to its confidence, and it called into question Russia's great power status. Mikhail Gorbachev had basically reformed the system out of existence, but the United States took much of the credit. American policy after the Cold War said that the Warsaw Pact countries of Eastern Europe and the 14 former Soviet republics are now independent and they can go their own way. The US invested heavily in democracy assistance for newly independent states and worked to bring new countries into the international trading system. It helped to build up their economies so that they would no longer be so dependent on Russia. And in general, the US did not pay heed to Russia's interests. The former satellites of Eastern Europe, plus several post-Soviet republics, chose to join NATO and the European Union. In 1997, NATO decided to admit the Czech Republic, Hungary, and Poland. In 2002, it admitted Bulgaria, Romania, Slovakia, Slovenia, plus the 3 Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania. Several other American foreign policy actions also worked against Russia. In 1999, the US led a NATO bombing campaign against Serbia, a longtime Russian ally. In 2003, the Bush administration withdrew unilaterally from the anti-ballistic missile treaty with Russia. Also in 2003, the US invaded Iraq over Russian and other objections. In 2007, the US installed a missile defense system in the Czech Republic and Poland. In 2008, the Bush administration encouraged Ukraine and Georgia to join NATO. Both of those countries are important for sentimental and strategic reasons for Russia. In each of these cases, Russia objected, the US got its way, and Russia ultimately acquiesced. The upshot was that by the time of the Obama presidency, Russia was pretty unhappy about the way things stood in the world. It saw that the US was throwing its weight around and was dismissing Russia's interests, or even worse, actively trying to keep Russia weak. So what did Hillary Clinton have to do with any of this? Nothing obvious, but she got blamed for certain things that were not her fault. For one, her husband Bill was very close to Boris Yeltsin. He was connected to the reforms in the 1990s that had harmed the Russian economy. Bill Clinton was also instrumental in the decision to enlarge NATO. Hillary Clinton became Secretary of State in 2009. And initially, she sought, as a member of the Obama administration, to reduce tensions with Russia through the so-called reset. But then in 2011, mass protests broke out in Russia in opposition to probably fraudulent parliamentary elections that helped Putin's party. And secretaries of state sometimes comment on events like this abroad. So Hillary Clinton did. She said, "We have serious concerns about the conduct of the election. The Russian people deserve to have their voices heard and their votes counted, and that means they deserve fair, free, transparent elections and leaders who are accountable to them." That sounds reasonable, right? Well, Putin took it personally. And he responded, she, meaning Secretary Clinton, set the tone for certain actors inside the country. She gave the signal. They, the opposition, heard this signal, and with the support of the US State Department, started actively doing their work. He continued, "We're all grown-ups here. We all understand the organizers are acting according to a well-known scenario and in their own mercenary political interests." It turns out Putin doesn't like protests. This is partly rational and partly maybe a bit of paranoia, but it's formative to his worldview as a leader. In 1989, Putin was working for the KGB in Dresden in East Germany. People were rising up across Eastern Europe against Soviet control. The day of the revolution, protesters came up to KGB headquarters in Dresden, and Putin immediately called the local Soviet military command for protection. In Putin's own words, the reply he got was, "We cannot do anything without orders from Moscow. Moscow is silent." And according to Putin, he said this was when he knew that the Soviet Union was doomed. This stuck in his head. During Putin's time in office, there were other revolutionary movements that had geopolitical implications. There were the so-called color revolutions in Georgia, Ukraine, and Kyrgyzstan. The revolutions in Georgia and Ukraine brought in new presidents who were anti-Western and pro-West, anti-Russian and pro-West. The Arab Spring protests were frightening to autocrats everywhere. And most critically, in 2011, when Medvedev was temporarily president and Putin was prime minister, Russia decided not to veto a UN resolution authorizing military action in Libya. And as we all know, that led to Gaddafi's downfall. In the end, a mob came for him. Secretary Clinton probably unwisely gloated about that episode, saying, "We came, we saw, he died." In 2014, Ukraine's Euromaidan was the last straw for Putin. In this episode, a pro-Kremlin Ukrainian president, Yanukovych, was overthrown by pro-European crowds, and a pro-Western government was installed. This was not an American initiative. It was not intended by either side to become an international flashpoint, but the results ended up working against Russian interests. The US saw it as a lucky break. Russia saw this as part of a pattern, and it began supporting separatists in eastern Ukraine and annexed the pro-Russian Ukrainian region of Crimea. So what was Putin thinking at this time in 2014? Luckily for us, he is not shy about speaking his mind, and he gave a long speech where he lists his grievances. And I'm going to show a couple excerpts of that now. This is in the original Russian with translations. Hopefully they're readable. I figured it was important to show the video rather than have me read the speech because you should look at his body language. He's very deliberate in what he says and how he says it, and it's important to pay attention to that. So here is the first clip.
В российском пространстве. И это в то время, когда Россия искренне стремилась к диалогу с нашими коллегами на Западе. Мы постоянно предлагаем сотрудничество по всем ключевым вопросам. Хотим укреплять уровень доверия.
By the way, can you see the subtitles in the back? Yes? Good.
Чтобы наши отношения были равными, открытыми и честными. Но мы не видели встречных шагов. Не видели их. Напротив, нас раз за разом обманывали. Принимали решения за нашей спиной. Ставили перед свершившимся фактом. Так было и с расширением НАТО на восток, с размещением военной инфраструктуры у наших границ. Нам все время одно и то же твердили. Но вас это не касается. Легко сказать.
Okay, and the second clip is at 29:07.
Веке продолжается и сегодня. Нас постоянно пытаются загнать в какой-то угол за то, что мы имеем независимую позицию, за то, что ее отстаиваем, за то, что называем вещи своими именами и не лицемерим. Но все имеет свои пределы. И в случае с Украиной наши западные партнеры перешли черту, вели себя грубо, безответственно и непрофессионально. Они же прекрасно знали, что и на Украине, и в Крыму живут миллионы русских людей. Насколько нужно потерять политическое чутье и чувство меры, чтобы не предвидеть всех последствий своих действий. Россия оказалась на рубеже, от которого не могла уже отступить. Если до упора сжимать пружину, она когда-нибудь с силой разожмется. Надо помнить об этом всегда.
I love that line. If you compress a spring all the way to its limits, it will snap back hard. That's a metaphor that encapsulates everything about the way Russia sees itself, or the way Putin sees Russia. So, flash forward to 2016. The Kremlin is not a big fan of Hillary Clinton, but she was the heir apparent. We don't know for sure, but we can imagine that the Kremlin speculated that at best she would continue the hardline policies of the previous administrations. At worst, she might try to prove her foreign policy toughness by trying to provoke Russia. And then Trump entered the picture. We know now that Trump has long had a soft spot for Russia. He visited the Soviet Union back in 1987. He worked hard to bring the Miss Universe pageant that he ran to Moscow in 2013. And he really wanted to build a Trump Tower there. The Mueller report documents this extensively. The Mueller report also documents what Russia did next. It engaged in a campaign of misinformation on social media. It hacked and released emails from the Democratic National Committee in order to divide Americans, hurt Hillary Clinton's campaign, and help Trump. So Trump won, and members of the Russian Duma popped champagne in celebration. As president, in the short term, it became clear that Trump continued to want to get along with Russia. So I'm going to show another clip here, and this one is probably one you've already seen. This is from the Helsinki summit in summer of last year. I'll just show a little bit of that.
Watching, tell President Putin, would you denounce what happened in 2016, and would you warn him to never do it again?
All I can do is ask the question. My people came to me, Dan Coates came to me, and some others. They said they think it's Russia. I have President Putin. He just said it's not Russia. I will say this. I don't see any reason why it would be. I will tell you that President Putin was extremely strong and powerful in his denial today.
That's probably all you need to see from that. So this sounds good for Putin, right? But did Russia actually get what it wanted? So to find out, I made a Russian wish list of things that the Russian government probably wanted from the US, and I divided it into 3 policy issues and 3 broader geopolitical goals. Roughly in the order in which they wanted these things. So one thing Russia wanted pretty badly was sanctions relief. Since the Ukraine war in 2014, the US had imposed visa restrictions and froze the assets of people close to the Kremlin or responsible for Ukraine policy, and also banned US companies from doing business with complicit Russian entities. Russia perceived this as an insult and an arbitrary way for America to try to weaken Russia and hurt its interests. Russia also probably wanted some kind of deal on Ukraine. In an ideal world, the US and the rest of the world would recognize Crimea as being part of Russia and maybe offer some sort of long-term guarantee of Russian influence over eastern Ukraine in exchange for ending the conflict. Russia also very much wanted to halt further NATO expansion. And then a few broader geopolitical goals, which all happen to begin with R. So Russia has long wanted the rest of the world to acknowledge that Russia has a sphere of influence in its broader region where it can act more or less freely. So a kind of Monroe Doctrine for Eurasia. Russia also wants respect. It wants the world to recognize Russia as still a great power. And it probably wanted revenge. From what we saw in the Crimea speech, Putin probably would enjoy taking the US down a peg to get back at America for bullying and for its self-righteous, hypocritical rhetoric of human rights and democracy. That would at least make him feel good. So what did they actually get from Trump? First, it didn't get relief from sanctions. On the contrary, the Trump administration has extended sanctions that have to be renewed periodically against officials and entities for the Ukraine war. And it has also levied new sanctions for Russian cyber attacks, for Russian actions in Syria, and for the poisoning of a former spy in the UK. There's also no deal on Ukraine. The Mueller report documents how a person associated with Russian intelligence, Konstantin Kalimnik, passed Paul Manafort, Trump's campaign advisor, a potential Ukrainian peace plan. And in the plan, supposedly there would be a provision that would allow Russia to control part of eastern Ukraine permanently. Well, the peace plan never went anywhere, and nothing has happened since Trump has been president. And besides this, the Trump administration approved selling lethal weapons to Ukraine, something that the Obama administration refused to do. What about NATO? Here it's no with an asterisk. So Montenegro was approved to join NATO in 2015, and it actually did join in 2017. North Macedonia, previously known as just Macedonia, was approved to join NATO in 2019, and it's scheduled to join next year. Bosnia-Herzegovina was invited to enter the Membership Action Plan. That's one step short of actually entering NATO just a few months ago, in December of 2018. There is no plan for Georgia and Ukraine to join NATO, but nobody expected that they would join anyway, and it's not likely that any president would have done anything differently. So what's the asterisk about? The asterisk is because Trump himself has a few reservations about NATO. And he expresses that in relation to a country I just mentioned, Montenegro. In an interview with Tucker Carlson, he is asked, why should my son go to Montenegro to defend it from attack? And Trump is apparently not a big fan of Montenegro. He answers, Montenegro is a tiny country with very strong people. They're very aggressive people. They may get aggressive, and congratulations, you're in World War III. So not a ringing endorsement of NATO and its main function of providing a collective security alliance. There is also no discernible move to recognize any informal Russian sphere of influence in Eurasia. In fact, at NATO meetings, there are discussions for plans to buttress support of the Baltic states, and there have been war games involving tens of thousands of troops simulating a Russian attack. Nothing has changed there. But what about respect? Here I would say yes. Russia looms larger in the world now than it did before. But this is not thanks to Trump. Rather, I would attribute this to US politics, that Putin has now gotten the respect he thinks he deserves. And Exhibit A is if we compare what Obama said about Russia in 2014, and I'll show you something to compare that to. So Obama said, this is back during the Ukraine crisis, Russia is a regional power that is threatening some of its immediate neighbors, not out of strength, but out of weakness. Putin took severe offense at this remark. Russia is a regional power. That's wounding. What about now? Some of you may have seen this too.
Attacked. We are at war. Imagine this movie script. A former KGB spy, angry at the collapse of his motherland, plots a course for revenge. Taking advantage of the chaos, he works his way up through the ranks of a post-Soviet Russia and becomes president. He establishes an authoritarian regime, then he sets his sights on his sworn enemy, the United States. And like the true KGB spy he is, he secretly uses cyber warfare to attack democracies around the world. Using social media to spread propaganda and false information, he convinces people in democratic societies to distrust their media, their political processes, even their neighbors. And he wins. Vladimir Putin is that spy, and
So you know you're doing something right when Morgan Freeman, who has played God, takes his free time to make a video all about you. So Russia has earned some respect. And then the issue of revenge, about taking the U.S. down a peg. Inadvertently, this has actually, I would argue, come to pass. But it's only partly due to Putin or Trump. So if one of Putin's claims is democracy isn't so great, if you look at American politics in the last few years, he kind of got lucky. Putin did not cause voter suppression, gerrymandering, politicization of the Supreme Court, climate change denial, susceptibility to fake news, mass shootings, or white supremacy. And I could go on and on. But if Russia sees the world in zero-sum terms, meaning America's problems are Russia's gains, then this would be considered a success. So when we examine the whole balance sheet, Russia has not gotten most of what it probably wanted, but where Russia has gained, it's not thanks to Trump alone. So why this contradiction? When it looks so promising that Trump would come through for his maybe friend, why didn't it pan out? There's a few possibilities. Some have argued that the Mueller investigation, while it was going on, constrained Trump. Everybody was watching closely. It limited his freedom of action regarding Russia. But I don't think that stands up to scrutiny, because if Trump were really afraid of what people thought of him, that he was being too nice to Russia, I don't think that would explain the things he's actually said publicly. He clearly didn't care. Trump has, whether deliberately or inadvertently, probably the latter, appointed Russia hawks. If you recall, initially, Trump's first team of officials included people who were actually pretty pro-Russia, Michael Flynn, Rex Tillerson, but they left. And now, Trump's immediate national security advisors, Pompeo and Bolton, well, he picked them probably because they came from Fox News and they talk tough on Iran, but that package also includes seeing Russia as an adversary. And so they're not going to help him. Congress is no friend of Russia. In 2017, Congress passed a law preventing the president from easing or ending sanctions against Russia without the agreement of Congress. And this law passed 98-2 in the Senate and 419-3 in the House. Besides Congress, career civil servants who are holdovers, who aren't appointed by the president, people like diplomats, intelligence officials, national security staff, the military, all these people have long experience seeing Russia as an adversary, and they do not agree with Trump. But they end up making policy, and they know how to do that. Trump himself does not really know how to make policy. He doesn't seem to care that much about actual policy. He definitely doesn't have the wherewithal to implement it. As a case in point of how the bureaucracy sets the agenda, just look at the 2017 American National Security Strategy, which is written by the executive branch, not by Trump personally, but Trump signs off on it. But here's what it says about Russia. Russia aims to weaken U.S. influence in the world and divide us from our allies and partners. Russia views NATO and the European Union as threats. Although the menace of Soviet communism is gone, new threats test our will. Russia is using subversive measures to weaken the credibility of America's commitment to Europe, undermine transatlantic unity, and weaken European institutions and governments. That's not so friendly. And more broadly, the US public supports tough policies toward Russia. This is a chart showing the average score of warmth or coldness toward Russia on a scale of 1 to 100, so you can look what it's doing over time. The Putin era begins when it's somewhere between 40 and 50, and now by 2017, it's at 31. So Americans don't look very favorably on Russia. And it's mutual. This shows how Russians feel about various countries. Are they mostly partners or mostly rivals? 84% of Russians see China as mostly a partner, and 85% of Russians see the United States as mostly a rival. So, to wrap up here, in spite of everything, in spite of what might have been a major shakeup in U.S. foreign policy, what we see is mostly business as usual. Low-level tensions, disagreement on major issues, attempts for Russia and the U.S. to work together on areas of common interest. But if Putin thought Trump would be a puppet, he didn't understand the U.S. political system very well. If Putin can claim any successes, it's more in the declining fortunes of the U.S. rather than Russian gains per se. And so I'll end with a tweet to come full circle. Trump asks back in 2013, do you think Putin will be going to the Miss Universe pageant in November in Moscow? If so, will he become my new best friend? Despite Trump's efforts, the answer appears to be no. It will have to wait until Trump is out of office. Thank you. And I am happy to take questions. Should I turn on the lights? Let's see if I can do that. Yes, in the front.
Your sixth bullet of Putin's wish list said on your play of it, take the U.S. down a peg, but another part of that when you first displayed it was to undermine the West. And it does seem that Putin, and a lot of this is higher than hearsay, but what would you say about Russia's overall European efforts in this respect? Fake news and the use of bots and so forth to undermine and thereby nationalist and
Yeah. So this is a question about Russia's activities in Europe apart from the U.S. So I did focus this talk mostly on the U.S., but from Russia's perspective, the grievances are both about the U.S. and Europe, which are sometimes called the West. And sometimes distinctions are made between the two, but often not. Putin and other Russian officials often make sweeping statements about the West as a whole, but you could easily swap out the word Europe or West for the US, and it would be the same grievance. So what kind of actions is Russia taking in response? They look pretty similar to the kinds of actions that Russia has taken in the US. It involves funding parties in the extremes, both left and right, seeking to undermine democracy in similar ways that it's done here, through spreading misinformation. There are rumors, sometimes with evidence that it supports protest movements that go against EU policy. And in general, Russia has sought out various ways, mostly incidental, mostly through social media, of trying to divide Europeans against other Europeans for similar purposes as it seeks to do that in the US. And it's been doing that for a few years. So it's difficult to assess winning and losing because I'm not sure what game is being played. I think Russia is playing one game and the US is playing a different game, and European countries are playing their own games. If you see the world in zero-sum terms, that anything that's good for Russia is bad for the US, then perhaps something that makes Putin happy should make Americans unhappy. But I'm not sure if that's the best way to see the world. So it's partly a matter of expectations. I think that by and large, the Kremlin does see the world in zero-sum terms. That is, something bad that happens to the US is, by definition, good for Russia. But I'm not sure if most Russians would agree with that, because ordinary people, both in Russia and the US, have concerns beyond foreign policy and beyond a feeling of schadenfreude. And I would argue that it's a tactic of manipulative politicians to use foreign policy demagoguery, to use manipulation as ways to win public support, because it's fairly easy without having to govern effectively. And sometimes these things work as substitutes. So Putin has managed to keep a pretty high approval rating throughout his entire presidency. It spiked when the Ukraine war started and Russia annexed Crimea. And after that, it took a while, but then it's sort of been trending downward as people have felt the effects of an economic slowdown, and that's resulted in some protests. So what is winning and what is losing in this case? Putin probably prioritizes staying in power for as long as he wants to, and if he has some plan to pass off the presidency to his chosen successor, he wants Russia and Russians to feel that their country is great. But I'm not sure that ordinary Russians would agree with his prioritization of issues. And certainly Americans are not a mirror image of Russians. So Putin may feel like he's winning, but that shouldn't make us necessarily feel like we're losing. Unless the reason that Putin is happy is because American democracy is dysfunctional, and then it's an American problem, and then we might feel like we're losing and we should do something about it.
What part does the oligarchs play in his administration?
So the way to understand Russia today is to see it as a centralized system with various factions or clans that are either closely or more loosely tied to the Kremlin. The so-called oligarchs that arose in the 90s no longer exist as such. They were either expropriated or exiled, or they declared their loyalty to the Kremlin. So there are two types of very wealthy people in Russia today. There are the heads of state corporations, like Gazprom, Lukoil, the heads of companies that mine and cultivate natural resources. And then there are owners of private businesses, CEOs of private corporations that are still pretty closely tied to the Kremlin. Oligarchs as such cannot act independently of the Kremlin today. If Putin asks for a favor among some of these very wealthy individuals, they pretty much have to comply. So, in a sense, it can be a means of state power when the Kremlin chooses to activate it. Otherwise, it's simply part of the Russian state. But unless things change rapidly, there's no serious threat that somebody who's very wealthy will actually go into opposition and survive politically long enough to make any meaningful difference. So Putin is what political scientists would call an authoritarian leader. Elections in Russia are not free and fair for various reasons that I could go into. There's no meaningful competition, and the rule of law does not function as it does in a functioning democracy. So Russia is actually a classic authoritarian country.
Russia is still dominant foreign security. If so, why?
I'm not sure if I'm in the best position to make that judgment. Maybe I'll rephrase your question. What are the security issues associated with Russia from the American perspective? I think first and foremost, America's interests lie in not fighting a nuclear war against Russia. And I think the Trump administration prioritizes that, and I also think Putin wants to avoid a nuclear war. As much as the US and Russia disagree about a lot of things, both sides have still put in place mechanisms to avoid direct clashes in which Americans could kill Russians or Russians could kill Americans that might possibly escalate into something more dangerous. This is the case with NATO. There's a hotline connecting NATO to the Kremlin, even though they don't like each other. In Syria, there have been American troops on the ground, there have been Russian troops on the ground, there have been Russian airstrikes, but the US and Russian military still keep in contact to avoid, again, an unhappy incident. When the US looks more broadly at its security interests in the coming years, I don't think anybody would argue against the fact that China is the other major power in the world. And Russia, like Obama said in 2014, mostly exercises its influence in its own region. To some extent, in the last few years, it's moving beyond the Eurasian region, getting more involved in the Middle East and Latin America, in Africa, but not in ways that I think any American official would say fundamentally threaten American interests in those countries. Way over there. So one confession, I didn't read the Mueller report from page 1 to page 400. I skimmed the important parts. I mostly read part 1 because that was something I had to read to give this talk. What was surprising to me actually was how much, for people who have been keeping up with this issue, how much has already been reported in the newspapers. There's a couple moments where the reporting is not about the US and Trump, because the coverage has been pretty good, but about how the Kremlin functions. And actually, if I can call up my PowerPoint again, there was one part I was thinking of discussing for people to whom it's interesting, and here's maybe a good time to do it. So there's one section in the report where they describe how Putin relates to people. I don't think they should be called oligarchs, so they're called Russian businessmen here. And the way that Putin runs this informal system. So this is directly from the report. It's based on an interview with Peter Avin, who's the head of Alpha Bank, a major private bank, but with close links to the Kremlin. And this is what Avin told the special counsel's office. He's approximately one of 50 wealthy businessmen who regularly meet with Putin in the Kremlin. These 50 men are often referred to as oligarchs, in quotes. Avin told the office that he met on a quarterly basis with Putin. Avin said that he took these meetings seriously and understood that any suggestions or critiques that Putin made during these meetings were implicit directives and that there would be consequences for Oven if he did not follow through. So, why is that interesting? For one, it confirms informed the speculative ideas that people have about the way the Kremlin runs. Because it's an opaque system, and because people like Oven do not speak on the record very often, we don't really have a window into how Putin operates. We see the effects when a policy is implemented, but we don't see the process by which decisions are made. So here's a case where Oven is saying that there's 50 people, 50 wealthy Russian businessmen, and that's kind of interesting because it's not clear how many people Putin thinks it's worthwhile to meet with. It could have been 10, it could have been 100. It's also interesting that they meet on a quarterly basis. So they convene and have a regularly scheduled committee meeting. And that's kind of sensible because there's a lot to talk about. But it's also interesting that in such an informal system, where at least from the outside, it's not clear why decisions are made, why somebody takes some action on a given day, that things are so regularized, and that there's this kind of talk shop, this forum, where these oligarchs, probably they're not doing a lot of venting, they're not complaining about Putin, that's for sure, but they're there to receive direction from Putin. And what kind of direction? Implicit. He doesn't go on the record and say, Oven, go out and do this. In fact, in this case, he's suggesting that Oven try to make contacts with the Trump campaign. This was after the election, before the inauguration, to try to feel them out and to figure out who speaks for the Trump campaign and who could be an entree to get to Trump himself. And he does this implicitly, and everybody apparently understands that if Putin suggests maybe you could do something, winks or winks, that you should take that as an order. And if you don't do it, Putin might get mad. So this is actually just a small paragraph in this broader section, which is a very interesting case study, kind of an ethnography from within the Kremlin, and you don't see that very often.
Future of the separatist regions in Azerbaijan supported by.
Okay, can I take them one at a time? No. So these are the so-called frozen conflicts. In Georgia and Azerbaijan, conflicts broke out in the late 80s, were mostly resolved. There were ceasefires in the early 90s, and since then there are undeclared aspirational potential states that don't actually have international recognition. And then in Ukraine, arguably, Eastern Ukraine is also a frozen conflict, although it's not quite frozen, there's actual fighting that still goes on. There's no obvious resolution in store. There are potential outcomes that might include, so to be specific, we're talking about Nagorno-Karabakh it's mostly an ethnic Armenian territory surrounded by Azerbaijan, Abkhazia and South Ossetia in Georgia, and Transnistria in Moldova. For people who aren't into this esoterica, this might not be interesting. The reason that they're probably not going to be resolved soon is that Russia has a veto over any possible resolution, and it's not clear why Russia would agree to either to the reabsorption of these territories into the country they're seceding from, or any other resolution. Currently, Russia does actually recognize these 4 territories as independent, and I think 3 other countries in the world also recognize these states, and it's like Venezuela, Nauru, and Nicaragua, and each other, like Abkhazia and South Ossetia, they recognize each other. But it's not likely that's going to result in any kind of actual statehood anytime soon. So for the long term, I think the best guess is status quo. Maybe 1 or 2 more? Yes.
Do you think that the recent meeting North Korea
Honestly, I knew that happened. I don't know what came out of that meeting. My guess it was mostly symbolic, and they probably said kind words about each other. Was there anything concrete I don't know about? So this is Putin being a statesman, but he has a particular penchant for being friendly with mostly dictators and mostly people who are not seen as strong American allies. Incidentally, though, these are also people that Trump likes to be friendly with, so things have changed a little bit. So this is Putin showing that Russia can exercise influence outside of former Soviet territory and showing that Russia is important and is a country that other countries might have to pay attention to. I'm sure Putin would love to also be a broker between America and North Korea, as it has tried to be in Syria and possibly Venezuela. And again, this is a marker of a powerful country that it can have this kind of influence in world politics. And that's high on Putin's agenda these days.
He said he would convey information and discuss with him.
Oh, he said he would convey information to Trump. Okay. I thought Kim just sent letters and Trump kept them in his pocket. Okay. Okay, so that's nice of him to be an intermediary. Maybe one more, way in the back.
What was your sincerity there?
So this is James Baker and Gorbachev. And there's dispute to this day about what was promised and how. So Russia claims that Baker, channeling Bush, pledged that NATO would not expand beyond Germany, a united Germany. But nothing was ever put down on paper. I think James Baker's notes have been recovered, and they say something about that, but there was no guarantee in writing. Russia claims that this is a broken promise. The US and the Clinton administration said no promises were ever made, and this is realpolitik. Countries act in what they see as their own interests, and sometimes other countries don't like the consequences. Thank you. He's afraid my voice should run out.